So the Justice Hub has been programmed and coordinated by Shared Assets and Lion. And we've got a few people in the room who've got particular roles. So we've got somebody who's on comms and they might be taking some pictures or videos. Cordelia, if you have any problems with being included in pictures, please could you go and let Cordelia know. We also like to have somebody who is taking care of well-being. So if anything comes up for you, or like you're feeling something and you need to talk to someone, then come and talk to me. I'm just going to be sitting down there. And yeah, we kind of like it to be an informal space, so if you do need to go and get water or go to the toilet, then obviously feel free to do that. So yeah, we've got a really fantastic session today with 3 panellists and 2 facilitators, looking at the connection between land justice and prisons and policing in the UK, and specifically at transformative justice. So I am going to hand over to Sabila to begin.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I think I'm very excited and happy to share this space together. And yeah, straight away, I'm going to kind of defer to our speakers to introduce themselves. And I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, their work, but also what abolition means to them, prison abolition means to them, and what and why we have to talk about prison abolition and land justice and environmental justice in the same breath, which is obviously a huge question, which is the purpose of our talk, but just like a kind of brief insight and initial thoughts on that. So I think we'll start.
And just before we begin, we will just to do a little content warning, because we're going to be talking about racist prisons and police violence and state violence. We will be talking or touching on racialized violence, potentially also sexualized violence, and other mentions of state violence and interpersonal violence. So just
thank you. So if we start with Kelsey.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Is this working now? Yeah. My name's Kelsey. I'm from a collective called Cradle Community, and I'll let Chelsea sort of tell you a little bit more about what we do, but we're a transformative justice experiment, and we're a collective of people who all have experience working and organising in abolitionist spaces. Today I'm going to be also sharing a bit of insight from organising against prison expansion, the new prisons that the government is trying to build all over the countryside. And yeah, I think for us, when we talk about prison abolition and land justice, I think for me, like, I'm not someone who, like, that's not the perspective I necessarily came to this work from. I came to this more from like a domestic violence perspective, or like that was sort of my insight into it. But as we have learned more about abolition, as we were producing this book that we put out called Brick by Brick, which was published by Hajar Press in 2001, kind of trying to make those connections about how abolition requires us to look at every part of our lives and every part of our world and see how policing and prisons and exploitation and surveillance and control show up in all these different areas of our lives. And when we start to really look at the criminal justice system and the history of it, it becomes very evident that land is kind of like where all of this started and is so key to the struggle for liberation for all of us because, we'll talk about a lot of the reasons why, but I think for me, one of the things that I really want to talk about is the way that consistently, like, marginalized people who have been colonized or are descended from colonized people have been either used to exploit land and have been exploited themselves and continue to be so, or are now primarily like living in urban environments with really restricted access to green space, to their like ancestral knowledge about land, and are the like primary targets for poorer health outcomes that are created by capitalism and by exploitation, right? It's the crowded areas that are where lots of marginalized people are housed, which is where we have like the worst rates of pollution, we have the worst air quality, we have the highest rates of things like asthma and respiratory issues for children. We have worst access to food and all of these things, which I think like all of that comes back to land, and all of that comes back to the ways that we are continually punished for being who we are. And so I think that's where I'll stop for now. But for me, I'm really grateful to be in this space, really grateful for all the people, including people from Land in Our Names, who have shared so much knowledge with us as we've learned about these topics, and all of the people that we've learned from, that will be kind of talking about ideas that we've learned from a range of people, basically, during this talk. And I just want to kind of show some gratitude towards that as well.
Right on. My name's Chelsea. I'm really excited to be a member of Cradle Community. That's the crazy experiment Kelsey was referring to. So we're a collective of women, feminine people, non-binary folks who are, organizers, social workers, facilitators, academics, who all pull together both our lived experiences and our politics and our ideas and hopes for the world to facilitate, workshops, violence prevention, bystander intervention, to facilitate conflict and transformative justice processes, and really to begin to create community within the organizing and grassroots space here in the UK. And so thrilled to be a part of that work and to be one of the co-authors of Brick by Brick. For me, I'm pumped to be here today as a hippie. I know I'm in a room full of hippies, and so I just have to say I'm so happy to be with my people. For me, abolition, and I'm an American and a political scientist, and an African-American descended from enslaved Africans. And so for me, abolition has always been tied to 40 acres and a mule. It's always been tied to access to land, freedom, and the right to self-determination, the right to make a future for yourself and your family, and to be able to cultivate a life from yourself, from the earth, There's more than enough of every resource that every human being needs to survive and thrive on this planet. And the fact that we charge each other money for it and exclude each other from it is a political choice, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so at a basic human level, I know that we're all entitled to this beautiful planet that we call Earth. And then as an organizer from a political perspective, just like the abolition of slavery was so intertwined with freedom and access to the land, just like the abolition of serfdom was so intertwined with freedom and access to the land. And now we have lords and ladies who sit in parliament and make decisions for our country, who also own significant swaths of the land in our country and prevent us from accessing the beautiful countryside and all the arable land that we could use to grow food, and maybe take some of that money from Mr. Sainsbury's family. So I say all that to say that for me, abolition is a building project. It's about creating a future that I want to live in as a Black, neurodivergent, queer immigrant in this country. And it's also about creating a future where we are not killing the planet. And I think that's where abolition intersects with land justice, and we can't move one without the other.
Hi everyone, my name's Jesse. I use they pronouns. I primarily organise on a mushroom farm based in Manchester, but when I'm not farming, I also do a lot of work around abolitionist struggles, particularly from a queer perspective. Up until recently, I was organising with a collective called Books Beyond Bars, which sends books and other resources to LGBT people who are incarcerated in the UK. And through that, I've had lots of letter writing, advocacy, working with people in prison to kind of help them get what they need. I think for me, I don't think what I'm going to say is particularly different from what you two have said, but I just add that for me, abolition is a goal of ending the logic of punishment and the common sense idea that punishment is necessary for justice. I don't think that is the case. It's an end to imprisonment and policing and surveillance and all of those kind of technologies that control people's lives, but it's a process at the same time, that kind of experimentation, that unlearning. So it's both an endpoint and a way of doing things in the moment. In terms of abolition's connection to the land, obviously Kelsey and Chelsea have talked quite a lot, or not loads, we've only just had the introduction, but have mentioned the relationship between colonised people and slavery and colonisation as being the place where, especially in the UK, we did our experimentations in policing before we brought it back here. The only other thing that I would say is that the process of enclosure in the UK created the social conditions that kind of created that urbanisation, where you had this surplus population of people that needed to be managed in that way with that capitalist mindset. So the formation of the workhouse and the poor laws to manage all of these people who'd been kicked off the land in how many centuries ago, that is a direct link between the prisons that we're building today. So the workhouse and the new prisons that are being built, which are essentially factories, you know, for people where people are paid nothing, £20 a week, to produce goods for sale, undercutting the wages of people on the outside. So that process is still happening. It's not changed. it's just got a different name and a different face.
Thank you. I'm Jalila. I'm a writer and researcher, and I
came to abolition, I did actually come through the kind of environmental justice angle. It was kind of presented to me with the simple fact that I was looking into the private companies that run prisons. And I started from kind of like a feminist angle, because I was finding a huge problem with the rates of women in prison that had been abused and assaulted and kind of stuck in these cycles of harm. And then I started to look into the mistreatment at prisons and how that was allowed to continue, and I started to learn about these private companies like Sodexo, Serco, and Mace, and I started to realize that these same companies were hugely responsible for like ecological devastation across the world, for worker blacklisting, for all kinds of different harms globally. After George Floyd's death, and one of the kind of reports that did kind of go under the radar was one that police in the US partly privately funded, much like the model of like prisons in the UK. And the private companies that were bankrolling these police foundations were Shell and various other like fossil fuel giants. And I became completely like compelled by this argument that land justice, environmental justice, and justice for people that have been a victim of capitalism, of colonialism, and all the harms in the world, like they're one and the same struggles. And yeah, I guess what abolition means for me is really about that it's a productive project, that it's about creating like systems and infrastructures, like concrete infrastructures of care, and changing our world so that we understand how deeply connected we are, and that the harm that we inflict harm as well as having harm done to us. And I think that the prison system as a whole and the logics of prison and policing relieves us of the most difficult questions about humanity, about why we inflict harm, about the social conditions, the isolation, loneliness, the abuse that creates a person that can inflict harm. And I think it relieves us of asking those questions about ourselves and our human nature. And I guess ultimately for me it's the kind of having the discipline to believe that we are better than that, and to understand that we owe each other a whole lot, and we owe each other explanations, and we owe each other patience for getting through our struggles of harm together. I personally have had my life like touched by incarceration, and I can see the damage that it does, and I can see that it's a incredibly harmful plaster on a wound that only makes that wound deeper. And yeah, if the structures we have to deal with harm today are sources of harm and conflict themselves, some of the worst harms in society, then I just believe that humans are fundamentally better than that, and that we owe each other abolition. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I use she, her pronouns. I am a researcher and an organizer based in Berlin. So I've come a long way. But I was living in the UK beforehand, and in that time, before I moved to Germany, I was kind of learning a lot about the land justice movement here, and kind of also seeing it grow over the past 5 years. It's become such an outlet for so many different causes, and that's been so exciting, seeing different kind of voices being kind of emerging from that. My research is on mainly the colonial nature of our food system, and the histories that have led to industrial agriculture as it exists today, being rooted in plantation slavery, and looking at like who produces our food today. We see the same imagery, we see the same patterns, and we see the same economic structures that were born in the plantation. So starting from the plantation as the kind of birth of the modern world and of our industrialized, the society that I live in, and all the wealth that I benefit from here being rooted in that, and then abolition and so as someone who was in food sovereignty organizing and seed sovereignty organizing for a long time, now seeing abolition as like the most logical conclusion of that, because abolition is the continuation of that same fight. Like, I think it's important to remember that the word abolition is from the abolition of slavery. So abolition is the unfinished struggle to end enslavement and the violent conditions that still exist and that are particularly visible, I feel like, in our food system. That exist in all economic kind of structures that we have under racial capitalism, but particularly in the food system are so very visible. So that's where I'm coming to. I also have had agricultural training over the last year, and for me that's been the place where kind of growing up in a family that grows and learning about like the abundance, like the scientific basis of that. I'm looking a lot in my research also on soils and how soils have been are impacted through industrial agriculture, and also community health, so the simultaneous kind of erosion of soils and of community health, and not just any communities, like poor communities, marginalized communities. So yeah, I feel like I'm rambling, but that's where I'm coming from too.
Okay. So I think really we're just going to start off by answering the question, what does a prison and what does prison construction have to do with land justice? So I think we're just going to open it up, but I was going to start by talking about one of the prisons proposed as part of the mega prison expansion, which has been one of the main kind of law and order lines of the Conservative Party over the last decade. And one of those is HMP Full Sutton in East Yorkshire. I'm from York, so kind of had some awareness of it before I came to this work. But yeah, I to start with, wanted to talk about how harmful prison construction is, simply because it's becoming an increasingly well-known fact that construction is harmful, that it produces air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, and this is a prison that has huge opposition from the local community, not on the grounds of racial justice, unfortunately, but on the grounds of not in my backyard. And I think like Cradle will talk more about the kind of like movement building against the development of like new prisons. But yeah, the site itself is essentially a site that could potentially have radiological contamination. It used to be a nuclear storage site. This is a very common issue in the US, where prisons are located on toxic like dump sites, essentially. Lots of them are located within like 3 miles of like Superfund sites, which are like huge areas of wastage, which are proven to be like toxic to humans. But obviously, if you are being put in a prison, you've already been cast as societal waste. So why not put a person in a literal dump and expose them to the toxins? So this is increasingly an issue in the UK as well, as more prisons are proposed. There's lots of other prisons with a few other prisons within the mega prison expansion list that have these issues as well of habitat loss. We know in the UK that we have a biodiversity intactness of 50.3%, and the proposed intactness to have like an ecologically stable world is 90% across the world. So it's an issue for land justice in that sense. But I also really want to start this conversation saying that you know, the idea of toxic sites, the idea of the air pollution that comes from vehicles involved in construction, and the noise and the communities that become vulnerable to this, as much as those are absolutely should be our priority, that this is a panel about the harm of prisons, and the harm of prisons exists as a human harm primarily, that people in prisons are as valuable as the people that are in this room today. And on a human level, we oppose prisons due to the harm that they do to people and the violence that goes on in them day to day. So I just want to set that straight first, that this is not a panel about we oppose prisons because they're environmentally damaging, but because we oppose prisons because they are that, and because they dehumanize whole populations of people and continue systems of dispossession and colonialism and racism that we find unacceptable. But yeah, if Cradle, like you want to talk about kind of opposition to mega prison construction?
Yeah, sure. Can talk about that a little bit. Because not everyone here might be kind of aware that the government for the last at least like 7 years or so has been planning to, and it's been trying to build at least 6, maybe 7 mega prisons around England and one in outside Glasgow in Scotland. The idea is to build 18,000 new prison places across the UK. So that means that that's not just 18,000 people that will... wait, is that the right number? Yeah, thank you. Fact checker over here. It's not just 18,000 people who are then going to be impacted by that system, right? That's, you know, with how many people go through short sentences, like even within a year, that's thousands and thousands more people who are impacted by that system. That's a dynamic number that is continually shifting when we already imprison more people than anywhere else in Western Europe, by the way. So this idea that we need more people in prison kind of, I think, just really highlights the Tories' perspective that is that actually we're just going to use prisons as a response to everything, right? There was this idea that we're going to police the pandemic away, right? And there's always this idea that we can... you know, just reduce societal problems by putting more people in prison. And we should be really, really aware of this coming out of, you know, post-Brexit, the pandemic, all of these things that are increasing unemployment, mental health issues, homelessness. All of these are the people that are going to be targeted for being swept up into the prison system, right? And there's a move towards having these prisons be built in primarily rural areas, which is a bit different from what Britain has previously done, where we had these Victorian prisons sort of in our cities, right? And while we're against prisons, we're also aware that when you put them in rural areas, that cuts people off even further, right? That puts them even further out of sight, out of mind. And there are these environmental impacts that are being used not because there are primary concerns, actually, because, as we said, it's actually the people that we're concerned about, but because it's actually a useful site of resistance, because people are very protective of our beautiful English countryside, right? And actually, a lot of these prisons, like the one outside Manchester and Chorley, that one, they were able to fight that planning permission and get that rejected. It is being appealed, but that initial rejection is based on the grounds that people are like, there's not even public transport to get people to this prison. So then, like, how much extra traffic is there going to be going through these tiny country roads to reach this place, through these tiny villages? The same thing in Essex, where they're trying to build 2 prisons in these tiny, beautiful villages in Essex. So the people who wouldn't necessarily be impacted by prisons usually, because there's a lot of like posh white countryside people, they wouldn't necessarily be otherwise concerned about prisons, but they are now, because it's impacting them too. It's actually these are areas where we don't have decent plumbing in our houses because they're really old. Why is the council putting this money into supporting the construction around this prison instead of helping us just have basic accommodations in our villages, right? And how are we going to, like, what's going to happen to all these tiny winding roads? They're going to be redone, they're going to be made bigger, there's going to be way more traffic coming to these prisons because people are going to be visiting. It also puts a massive strain on things like local services, your local A&E, mental health services, and all of these things. And so bringing those issues to the countryside has actually also meant that there's further resistance, and kind of people who are getting interested in abolition who wouldn't necessarily have thought about it as much otherwise. At least that's what we're finding in our organising. Like we found in Full Sutton, it's not always going the full abolitionist way, and sometimes you've got to like look at the long game and kind of be like, okay, at least if we can resist this prison, we can keep having those conversations with people to think about it's not just about not here and you'd rather it over there, but actually why are they building these prisons at all right now, right? And having that conversation. Why are they targeting you for building these prisons? Why are they choosing these areas? And so I think, yeah, it's really important to be keeping track of what's going on, because it might be that some of you live actually like in an area that now there's a prison that's going to be built locally, and you could be a really key part of that resistance because you know what the local issues are in your local area, you know what's going to chime with the values of people who live in your local area. So I really want to just shout out like where those prison construction projects are at the moment. We have Full Sutton in Yorkshire, we have one in Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire. We have 2 in the Midlands, Glenparva, and one in and Wellingborough, which is called Five Wells, which has opened now. It's replacing an existing prison that was closed down there. And then we have Chorley, which has gone to appeal, but was resisted and rejected on the first round. That's Chorley in Lancashire. And we have the 2 in Braintree, Essex as well. And there's multiple prisons across the countries where they're also adding new wings. So they're expanding existing prisons as well. And so I just really want to, like, I guess, name those because there's a lot of people here who I haven't seen at our talks before. So it's, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, 2 small things. The first piece is around prisons themselves and about the impact on the, like we talked about, the environmental impact. So we're thinking of the future that we want to build and things like, you know, carbon neutral future, and thinking about, you know, the building materials that we use, the ecological impact, you know, are we using LED lights? So, you know, all of these things that we're thinking about in kind of modern construction. And then thinking about the kind of innovations that are happening in criminal punishment. And a key kind of intersection of this, something I learned when I was doing my criminology degree that really disturbed me, but they did essentially a competition where they had master's students at Cambridge to, essentially they gave them this building material and said, how can you, this carbon neutral building material, how can you create an entire cell, 6 by 9 foot cell, 6 by 9 meter, cell of this material, and make everything from the bed to the toilet to everything in the cell from this one material. They had a competition, and you have all these environmental science majors come in and designing the prison cell. Oh, it's going to be carbon neutral. That's the danger that we can fall into if we don't start to be critical and ask these questions, right? So the reason I want to bring that example and highlight it is we can't girl boss land justice. If you don't know what I mean by girl boss, it's the despicable thing that capitalism has done to what used to be feminism. You know, and so we can't do that with environmentalism. We can't do that with our planet. We can't do that with our earth. We can't come up with a more carbon safe prison. We can't come up with, you know, less of an impact. Don't let someone sell you more surveillance by telling you that it's going to have a less, you know, less impact on the planet than them physically building a prison. Really think critically around these things. And to the second point that, Kelsey, when you raised the point of the Tories expanding prison paces, I would invite you to go to the Ministry of Justice website, because they're telling you how many people they want to put in prison over the next 10 years. And if that doesn't frighten you, to go to a government ministry website and they tell you, yeah, this is how many people we want in prison by 2030. What? And as an American, I listen around all day to British people telling me how terrible the prisons are in America, how terrible mass incarceration is. But stop comparing yourself to America and start comparing yourself to the rest of Europe. And you'll see that England has a mass incarceration problem. And that your government is actively telling you they want thousands and thousands more people in prison 5 years from now. That's not okay. So I really want you to look at it on a really basic level and really challenge that, because that's one of the rumblings of fascism. When we say the canary in the mine, growing prison paces is one of those canaries where we're starting to look at how are we going to solve social problems, how are we going to solve cultural problems, expanding the prisons. And the only other thing I would raise here is this is at the same time when 50% of prisons in the UK fail to provide adequate health care. This is at the same time where, according to government regulators from the Ministry of Justice, a quarter of our prisons fail to provide adequate human safety, according to the government itself, evaluating its own prisons. And you're struggling with prison officers. Prison officers are leaving the industry in droves. I think that's a great thing, actually. But the government is really ramping up its efforts in terms of recruitment, trying to recruit younger, more hip, different, diverse people from different backgrounds to work in prison. So again, these are things that you have to push back on when you're seeing people in your community that are considering these jobs and these roles, thinking about, so take that NIMBY perspective and take your hippie perspective and put those two together whenever something around prisons or policing is coming up in your local community, and think how you can challenge that and chip away at it.
I wanted to add on the greenwashing front, like specifically around Full Sutton.
Yeah.
Like recently, there was like they're doing this kind of this greenwashing and this like PR, this like positive PR move around prisons and making them green. So it's like I think Full Sutton is going to be the first all-electric prison. And of course, that means that what you said about jobs, like there are people who are architects and designers and like engineers and all these people who are making careers out of making prisons greener and seeing that as like a positive move for social justice. And as abolitionists, we really need to look at those kinds of reforms and see that all we're going to see as a result of that is more and more prisons, and it's going to be those same principles that are put into, because it's going to be those same architects and those same people who are then designing our schools and our hospitals, right? Like they build those careers and then they go on to design other things with these same things. And we are seeing our schools and our hospitals becoming increasingly securitized and controlled and surveilled, right? And so we really want to like push back on this as like, that's not how we're gonna like work our way to liberation, is by taking these same institutions and making them more environmentally friendly, right? Yeah. It is toxic to our people. It is toxic to have prisons. Like prisons are toxic, and I've learned so much from our comrades in the US, who organise with Fight Toxic Prisons and the Prison Ecology Project, who have really looked at the ways that when we're looking at climate catastrophe, when we're looking at the toxicity like in our society, if we look at prisons, that is where it all starts, that is where it all comes to a head, right? That is where it all connects. And so when you see how the people in our prisons are left when there is climate catastrophe like hurricanes and earthquakes or heat waves or tsunamis, there is no evacuation plan for people in prisons, right? There is no backup prison for the prison, but they have exactly the same level of, like, the same rules technically apply. It's like the same level of duty of care, right, within prisons. And yet, obviously, you don't get the same level of medical care. You don't get the same safety precautions if you happen to be in prison when there is a catastrophe, right? And so we know that there are people in the US who are fighting to create evacuation plans and get people evacuated during things like hurricanes and natural disasters. And as we see things get more and more extreme in this country, we're already seeing that prison cells are getting incredibly hot during the summers, and we're seeing that there isn't adequate ventilation, there isn't adequate facilities to keep people alive during extreme weather conditions in our prisons. It's only going to get worse, and so building these new prisons is not actually going to help that. It's just going to build more and more prisons that they say are better, but people are going to keep dying. And so we really need to be doing something else, right? We need to be looking at something that's not putting people in prisons as a ways to respond to like what is like increasingly dangerous conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so many levels on which I think abolition raises so many important questions for environmentalists or like people that are active in climate activism. And I think people, because of the reasons that you said, because natural disasters will only increase, and we're living with record temperatures in this country, that amongst other freak events, that people in prison are increasingly on the front lines of the climate crisis. And it's like the Combahee River collectors say that to put yourself truly on the front of the most important struggles of your time is to ally yourself with the people most neglected, most vulnerable. And I think when we were talking about the movement building with communities that oppose prison construction in their area, there's a group called SWAP that are resisting prison being built on what was an RAF, an airfield. And their proposal is to essentially turn the site back to nature and create a site for rewilding. But rewilding has a lot of issues in itself, and I think this is exactly why abolition is also just an incredibly important tool for environmentalists, because it asks us to question the basis of everything. So rewilding, could be hugely powerful for storing carbon, for restoring biodiversity, etc. But this reclaiming all of the sites that currently belong to the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Defence is also a huge opportunity for finally carrying out reparations to communities that have been left without land and have been dispossessed. We know that we have access to 92% of land in this country because it's private estates and owned by various people with very dodgy pasts. I think that that it's an incredibly important site to build coalitions to resist prisons, whether it's on the basis of not in my backyard or on the basis that prisons shouldn't exist. But I also think that what abolition brings is a critical tool for thinking about land justice in that way, that it's do we want those areas to be completely cut off and told that we can't walk on them in fear of harming whatever life might emerge in these areas, or do we want to restore land to people that have historically been without it? And that is a huge, huge problem in this country, land access and access to green space, which the pandemic just revealed even more. But even this morning, I was reading about the health ramifications of being in green space and how much of a huge issue that is in this country. And for example, you just have to look at the statistics to see how many people have access to a garden, and disproportionately black people, people of colour, those families don't have access to green space of their own, never mind don't live within in proximity of parks or recreational spaces that are also places that where nature thrives, or where there's enough trees. Trees produce these hormones that essentially are passed on to us and alleviate our stress and improve our general well-being and our mental health. And we know that poor mental health, isolation, not being able to kind of have access to all these things that promote human well-being are huge factors in producing the conditions that produce crime. I think that's a really important environmental and land justice question, what we want these sites to be restored to and the opportunity that holds. And once these sites stop being constructed, that's a whole lot of money saved. I think Kelsey and Chelsea, you probably have better statistics on this, but the amount of money that goes into building these prisons is will take your breath away. And in 2019 or 2020, it was £42,670 spent on each prisoner in that year. That is a whole lot of money that could go on reparations to the people that have been wronged by the UK's past of racism and colonialism, to which we owe a whole lot of people today who live in poverty and with lack of access to land and therefore the ability to live well in this country. And I think, yeah, that's a really important question, and why prisons really are an issue of land justice and one of the most important ones. And last thing I'll say for handing back is that, like you were saying about if the prison space is there, they'll fill it, and they want to, and that is the intention. And you know, most environmentalists are aware of the public order bill and the PCSC bill, but you know, the issue of the green scare of increasingly militant or increasingly visible climate activism, and you know, there are quite terrifying numbers of Just Stop Oil or other environmental protesters in prison, and some of these are children just looking to save their futures, but instead they've landed themselves in a cell. And again, I think abolition asks environmentalists, people in that space, to keep being critical and understand that these systems of oppression all work together. And yeah, and if there's a prison space there, they'll use it. And yeah, I'll hand back to you guys.
Can I actually ask Jessie and Sophia a question? I'm probably not supposed to do that. But okay, two separate questions, but they're related. Jessie, you said you work on a mushroom farm. I'm obsessed with mushrooms, and I think if human beings just acted like mycelial, like everything would be solved on this planet. Like honestly, we could fix everything if we just modeled ourselves after mycelial networks. But my question for you is about cultivating, you know, food and growing growing things with your hands and having that reconnection to you know, nature, and how do you feel as an individual that's a part of like an abolitionist ethic? And then kind of carrying on from that, Sophia, if you could answer afterwards, how does us disrupting industrial agriculture, returning to things growing like the Three Sisters, you know, pairing different plants and food forests and, you know, all of these new ways of growing, how does that offer us a new abolitionist future? I need some optimism, and I'm hoping you're gonna give it to me, Jessie.
Yeah, I mean, I really have a mixed feeling about the mycelium as a metaphor, but I think it's really useful for a lot of people. I think ecology as a metaphor for abolition is really useful, because you have a consort of lots of different actors doing lots of different things. And to create a viable, livable world that doesn't have punishment in it, what we need is housing, healthcare, education, we need access to land, all of this stuff. And the chances are that every single person here is doing some form of abolitionist work, even if they don't know it yet. And they might not have connected necessarily to a person who's incarcerated or experiencing incarceration, but creating that livable world is abolitionist work. And there's ways that you can connect more to people inside, definitely. And maybe later we can talk a little bit about concrete stuff that people can do. But that metaphor of ecology, of soil ecology in particular, of having things broken down, like seeing the institutions of the prison and seeing that it would actually make really good compost to grow something new, that's nice. I work when I'm not growing mushrooms. I also teach ecology, and I teach with the Open University, and we get a lot of students who are incarcerated, and we get so many students who want to study ecology who are incarcerated, and that's because they have no connection with the natural world inside their concrete box. And they're crying out for something, some connection to nature. We have a project where we ask people to kind of do their own experiments, and unfortunately for the people in prison, I have to give them data because they don't have access to anything, greenhouses, tarmac only. And so much of what I've heard already this weekend has been about how access to land and working with the land has been healing for people. And I think it has a huge, huge role to play in helping people who have experienced incarceration on the out. And I think everyone in this room and our movement has a role to play in kind of connecting with those people and making nature something that they can connect with. Imagine a world in which you have agricultural cooperatives with formerly incarcerated people as directors, or having opportunities on your farm for people who are recently released from prison to connect with the soil and the land that they have been disconnected from for however many years. I think what we have is something really powerful within this movement, and if we thought about making those connections, though, that kind of ecology could be really powerful, really transformative, for sure.
Wow. Yeah, thank you, Jesse.
No.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for. You led us on really nicely to the next part, which is thinking about abundance and thinking about what the land actually teaches us about abolition for our abolitionist futures, and then thinking about what an abolitionist agroecology or abolitionist food justice might look like, and what land justice might look like when we take abolition as our starting point and when we take transformative justice as our starting point. I think just, I'll keep it brief, but I think it's just, we all know, like those of us who are working around food, like what industrial agriculture needs is the erasure of relationships and the erasure of a relationality and the codependency that is inherent to any existence on this planet. And working with the land, we know how important these dependencies are. Industrial agriculture instead then manufactures these fake codependencies with pesticides and with fertilizers, an industry that is so violent and that has come from histories of genocide. And so I think those of us working with the land and with soils and with plants, and those of us working with communities of all sorts, know like the abundance that is inherent to what we can have when we work with each other and when we work with the earth. And so I think it's really interesting and important when we think about the links between food and health and access to land, what we're kind of all here to think about, but also things like nutrition and pollution and how that impacts community health so disparately. Like marginalized, the poor. There's studies around like immune health where people are already being born with so much lower immune systems based on environmental factors like pollution, based on what people are able to eat. And we're all here to think about food systems that don't reproduce that violence. So also coming back to the land and to agriculture and growing and how that needs to be have the kind of abolition as a starting point. Also, one last thing I wanted to say is abolition. We were talking a lot about prisons. Detention centres are inherent to that same movement. We need to dismantle borders. Like we've talked a lot at the ORFC already around land justice, around privatisation of land and the histories that have led to like the carving up of land and the construction of borders, but actually how that is creating infrastructures for people, for populations to become disposable, to become then exploited as migrant labourers, as migrant farm labourers here to produce the food that we eat. That's an inherent part of that as well. I just wanted to bring that in. So much more to say. I think there's people, I think, thinking about abolition ecologies and abolitionist agroecology. It's kind of cropping up everywhere, and it's cropping up from people with experience on the ground. It's a lot of academics are talking about it, and it's a very buzzy word, but it's coming from the knowledge of the movements that are doing the work like you are, and so it's really, really amazing to hear about that.
Can I just say something about abundance? I'm looking at Talila's laptop, and it says on the sticker, which is our teacher in this moment. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And I think actually that's a really good thing to say is we live in an abundant world. Scarcity is a myth. And when you look at the budgets for policing and prisons, 5.5 billion a year on policing, on prison, 19 billion a year on police. You've got now the average prison place costs roughly 50 grand a year. So that's one person in jail costs the taxpayer £50,000 a year. And there's people in jail for like not paying their fucking like TV license, which is like, just give them the 50 grand. Like, come on. So there's that. The new prisons, they're much higher. So we're looking at over 100k per prison place in these new prisons. So the money is there. Imagine if somebody who is doing survival crime to make their way just had an injection of like cash. Like, you don't even have to give them the full 100k, just give them something. Like, that's a house. Like, yeah. It's so ridiculous that that we've been kind of fed this idea that there isn't enough, and that prisons are the only way, when they're just huge amount of resources and only there to kind of build up the logic of punishment and control this population that people consider to be surplus. It's fucking, I don't know, very angry.
Right on. If I could add two pieces. The first one is a book recommendation. Please read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, okay? That book taught me how we came to live in the world that we live in right now. Because we live in the imagination of a few wealthy men who had specific ideas about scarcity, about who a human being was, about what intelligence looked like, about what culture was, about how a woman should give birth, all of these things, right? And we're currently living in their imagination. And Guns, Germs, and Steel will help you understand how we went from cultivating wheat and deciding that we should live together rather than going from hunter-gatherer and moving into an agrarian society, and how we moved from an agrarian society into serfdom, into all the systems of oppression that then followed. And so if you would want to read anything that connects these things in a really incredible way, I would recommend that book. I'm a nerd, so I'm always going to give you a book rec. And then the second piece is to what you said about abundance, Jesse, and how much power we actually have to recreate the world. I would just quickly ask, how many people know where the closest prison is to where we are right now? Yes.
Bullingdon, probably.
Yes. Yeah, I would say Bullingdon or Huntercombe. It would be between. So if you said either of those two, it would have been right. I think Bullingdon in Bicester is slightly closer than Huntercombe. Huntercombe is a foreign national prison. But I would just say, if you want to get involved in anything as a organizer, reach out to either of those two estates and see if there's any way. Huntercombe has an open program, as does Bullingdon, if I'm not mistaken. So just see if you can get involved with them in any way, to Jesse's suggestion around giving people access to the land. And just the last thing about abolition, just wanted to read a quote from Brick by Brick, because I think it pulls together so much of what we've talked about today. Liberation means the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the delicious food that we eat must not be fraught with exploitation, but rather becomes part of holistic nourishment of our bodies and communities. As we root ourselves in the struggle against empire, we reclaim the land, engaging with and integrating old and new practices of technologies of cultivation and production. We must work at a different pace, a slower one. We must rest. Building a world without prisons requires us to truly commit to deep interdependence and to the repair and transformation of our relationship to the land and its ecosystems. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. That is a perfect roundup because we can now move on to questions. We have questions from our live audience here, and we are also taking questions from our online audience. Oh, yes. Yeah. The person in the front row.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. I just had a question. We're coming from California, from occupied Ohlone territory, and just coming from that perspective, a lot of work we talk about in where we are in our agriculture and urban farming is talking about how to decolonize our land practices on stolen land. And I just had a question about how do we translate like decolonial land practices and care for land in like colonizer soil, and how does that translate to justice for incarcerated peoples?
I can take a small stab.
You wanna?
Thank you for this question. I think the first piece when you said about decolonizing our relationship to the land, especially when we're on stolen land, which, you know, that's a whole thing. You know, it's that it's about collective stewardship. We were talking about this earlier, actually, and I give honor to Kelsey for giving me the word stewardship, because first I said collective ownership, and there was something about that that still felt off, because as a species, we are really arrogant when it comes to this planet. We think this belongs to us, like we have any more right to it than the fireflies and the bumblebees do. We don't. So it's not about us owning or controlling the land. That's the other thing. That comes from the white male imagination. The idea that we can control nature and get her to do what we want her to do. That's not our place. We need to learn how to get into the ecosystem and flow with it. So it's about stewardship. We have skills and abilities in these bodies that other species on this planet don't have. So how are we employing those to the stewardship of the land? So when you're thinking about urban farming, how are you all looking into, so literally do research where y'all are farming at. Look into the soil. What's missing from the soil? Nitrogen, plant nitrogen rich. You see what I'm saying? Crops. So you're giving back to the earth. You're not just taking from it. You're not just saying, give me some tomatoes. You're saying, no, let me give you some nitrogen. Let me give you some, carbon. Let me give you this, because I'm peeping what's going on around here. If y'all are taking up abandoned lots, the beautiful thing about urban gardening is it doesn't just have ecological impacts. It has social impacts as well. So there's a criminology study that found when they took 4 vacant lots in Chicago within 2 blocks of each other and turned them into green spaces. And within a month, you had a 40% reduction in gun crime on each one of the blocks where they put the green space at. So it's like the power in you creating a space where, one, you're not controlling nature, but you're stewarding it. You're not taking from the earth, but you're giving back. And these are also the skills that you're teaching the young people and everyone who's involved with the project. And then also you giving back to your local community as well by now creating a safe green space and actually bringing pure oxygen into your community as well, in a place where we know we're struggling with air pollution. So there's so many ways that just you doing that little plot of land and taking those small like tidbits and putting them into the land will really, I think, have a real impact.
I do want to also, acknowledge as well that, places like Turtle Island are, currently under occupation, right? And there are Indigenous people who are engaged in struggle that, we can talk about urban farming. I think all of that is super, super valuable, all of these things, but also there is the active resistance to the current violence that is also happening, and it is frequently Indigenous people and colonized people who are on the front lines of that resistance, right? It's the pipelines, it's all of that in the US that is kind of it's frequently people from Indigenous communities who are criminalized at really high rates for that resistance, and who are actively having their land destroyed and taken from them. And so our solidarity, if we're not part of those communities is to like join that resistance, to raise up that resistance, to raise up those voices, and to fight alongside those people, because we can be like creating our own allotments and our own little gardens and stuff, but we also need to be like fighting alongside people as well, I think. And I wanted to also say, I guess like I've been trying to think more about like what this work looks like across borders, and my heritage is from the Caribbean, and so that's like where I'm sort of more familiar with in terms of thinking about these ideas. And I really think that we're in a time where like it just feels like there's a moment right now where a lot of places are like starting to have these conversations about decolonization, and places like Barbados where and Guyana and Jamaica, where they're on the front lines of flooding as a result of the climate crisis, and they are also like continually exploited by the global north, right? And starting to have these conversations about actually what does it look like to really be able to grow our own food and be able to eat it ourselves? Because frequently, like across the global south, it's like there is farming that's happening, but like people aren't allowed to eat their own food that they grow, right? Because it all has to be exported to the global north. It all has to be sold by these big corporations, and all that land is owned by big corporations. And so decolonization, of course, means being able to steward our own land and like be able to create that self-determination through being able to create our own resources and kind of like start to revisit like actually what is it that works in these spaces, because places like the Caribbean, like it isn't all indigenous people who are there, right? It's people who are brought there. It's a lot of like foreign plants that are now growing there, and of course that stewardship will look different. And I think we are so detached, a lot of us, from like that history and really what these places even looked like before colonization, that there's so much work and knowledge that we still have to learn. But there is also so much that like we have continued to carry with us. And I guess one of the things that I think about is, because I started making tiger balm during the pandemic, and that's something that's like a really ancient healing recipe that like came from East Asia to the Caribbean, and like it's just really about like knowing that like ginger has this like healing property, and that there are these herbs and plants that even through colonization, like the fact that that is something that has persisted still, and it's something that's specifically about like aching muscles, right? It's like for people who are working really hard and like needed that, and needed like, and the way that like those same plants and properties are now like you pay a lot of money to pharmaceutical companies for the same like things, right? But we have that knowledge, and we have been frequently like detached from it. But I guess there's these things that I hold on to of like we do have these things, and we can use them as a starting point to look at our histories and to start kind of relearning, I guess.
Yeah. Can I just add a recommendation? I hope I'm remembering the name of this collective right. I think it's called the Yellowhead Institute, but they have a really extensive abolitionist kind of reading list from an Indigenous perspective that I found really useful when thinking through some of these issues, that I'd highly recommend. I would Yellowhead Institute, I think that's what they're called. It's been a while since I looked at it. The only other thing that I would say is that being in the UK, be mindful that like our process in colonisation hasn't really stopped, and especially within the conservation movement, there are so many people, so many organisations buying up land in Africa, South America, and with the idea of putting a big fence around it to protect the wildlife, shooting and killing and doing all sorts of horrible things to people who used to live on that land. And some of conservation's biggest and brightest and shiny stars have been complicit in that, and some big organisations that a lot of people in the UK donate to have been involved in those stuff. So just check that out and have a think before you donate.
Yes.
Those mercenary groups.
Could I add one thing? Can you hear me if I speak like this? Sorry. Sharing the mic. I just wanted to say I think I've also thought about this a lot. Like, what does it mean on colonizer soil? And like, how does land justice translate from a settler colonial context to a colonizer soil context? And I think it's, for me, the most important thing when we talk about these things is we understand how we are here where this violence emanates from, like historically and today. And this violence is turned outward and was turned outward, but also inward. And there's this boomerang effect, you know, of where imperial colonial violence is being imposed on settler colonies is being refined in these spaces and then turned inwards against marginalized populations here. And so I think reading on histories of kind of European internal others and the histories of like the development of like racism in Europe, particularly internally and in Britain especially, is really, really important for us to understand and to be in solidarity with struggles against settler colonialism, and also just following the money, because so much of the violence that Indigenous people in settler colonies are resisting is directly being funded by our taxes. So there's like very clear material links and the kind of links of knowledge production that all emanate from here, and that is our responsibility when we're operating on from colonizer soil. That is our responsibility, and to make those links clear. Yeah.
Sophia, can I just make a point about that, just because PR brought up California? Sure. Yeah, just quickly. Sorry for going out of place here, but it's really important to talk about abolition and settler colonialism, and that this has happened to imprisonment first began to the Indigenous people. I just wanted to bring up quickly that Karina Gould, the chairperson of where we live in the San Francisco Bay Area, Ohlone Territory, always says that when the Spanish came, to make the missions, they imprisoned, they enslaved the Indigenous people, the Ohlone. That's what they first did. So it's really important, everyone, that when we talk about abolition, to definitely remember that imprisonment, the prisons started with the Indigenous people of the lands.
Thank you.
I think that guy was
Yeah.
the one over there. Yeah. They rose their hand a while ago.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a little bit. I think it was mentioned at the start of the talk about how these new prisons are essentially like factories. So where prisoners are essentially being paid very, very little, about £20 a day.
A week.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just like I think this was something Chelsea said, that there is a lot of awareness in the UK of how bad the American prison system is, but there doesn't seem to be any. I mean, that was something I didn't know that was the level of exploitation that was going on there. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about. All right, what work is being done in prisons? What companies are using prison labour? And just could you expand on that point a little bit? Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of different companies that do that have prison labour that are based in the UK. I think. There's a list.
What's it on? The poppies that you get, they're all made by people in prison.
Yep.
Yeah.
The red poppies.
Wilkinson.
Just as one little.
Yes.
Wilkinson's, Timson Shoes actually has turned it into a big PR exercise that they use prison labour.
Yeah,
but
he's on the board of the Prison Reform Trust and stuff.
Yeah.
Out here, isn't it?
The CEO. Yeah.
Timpson's.
Yeah.
Like if you're working in a charity and they're trying to support
Yeah.
other charities, it's prison labour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's which is it?
These prisons, they're also registered companies.
Corporate Watch.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they've got a
for
list.
the people
Oh,
who
yeah.
are virtually.
Corporate Watch.
What I was saying is that in the UK, coffee is one of the products. So if you're, there's also, I think, even a beer, or maybe, I'll go and look at my organization list that they tried to commission, and it was a big fight. I won. We do not have any products that are being supported by prison labor, and it was a very challenging conversation. It was like 45 minutes of arguing with me against 40 other people in terms of why this isn't a good thing, because they only saw it as like they're being upskilled, they're being empowered. I was like, well, when you bring me back the statistics that says how many people who are a part of this prison labor have been released and have been offered a job in that company, or how many have even applied to that job, how many have been denied, how many can even walk into any coffee shop and get a job and not be what's the word I'm looking for? Discriminated against. And so it goes, there's many levels to it, and not just thinking about they're walking out with a skill. A lot of people, you can't even offer me a Starbucks. Starbucks used to support prison labor in terms of picking coffee beans. I will judge you. Victoria's Secret used to sew the women prison labor would sew the labels into the back of those clothes. There's a lot of labor that happens just in items that you love, that you cherish, and it's really about looking into that. So you're not a part of that system, and part of it is, the argument for me is like that 20 pounds that you think that is inspiring that family, or is, you know, going to that individual, does not go back to those families. That's a person who is, you know, not able to financially support their family anymore because they're in prison. And if you think 20 pounds or however many cents is supporting them, no. The things that they have to pay for inside of those prisons cost far more than 20 pounds. Exactly. And that works both ways, because even the families are exploited for those phone calls. So it goes down to everything. We really have to become conscious about what we're investing in, because we could be investing in our own oppression, or the oppression that's happening within our homes, within our neighbors, within your friends. So if you really love yourself and you love everyone else, start looking into the products that you're investing in and question them, question your organizations, and hold them accountable.
Great.
Corporate Watch.
Yeah. So I think Corporate Watch has a UK list, but the other thing to say is that people in prison are so bored that they really want to do this work, and because the alternative is just being kept in the box, looking at the four walls. So, like,
that's coercion.
It's coercion.
You can't have labor. You can't have labor without freedom.
Yeah.
And also, if you don't have the right to retract your labor, you don't have the right to take a break. You don't have the right to take a sick day. That's slavery.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., they just told you point blank. In the amendment, they told you slavery is illegal unless you have been convicted of a crime. So, you know, in the U.S., they just told you straight up, oh, no, you're a slave. But here, you know, it's still, if you don't have the right to retract your labor, it's not free. You're not free. You're a slave. You're an indentured servitude. And it's whack, man. It's not cool.
I'm sure it's the same probably in the US, but here they use it as another punishment tool where people are so bored that they want to do the work, and so if they misbehave, they don't get to do work.
Job,
they go to work, they don't get to study.
It's all anything that's seen or posed as like a good thing or a good reform for prisoners is also used as a punishment inside, right? So if you have a nicer facility, you have gym equipment, you have anything, that can also be used to be refused, right? So it's all used to control you, right? And and it's the same with work. We know that people are paid up to £20 a week. The like worst paid jobs in prison are like £7 a week. These new prisons, they're going to have like much bigger, like massive workshops to have like basically these factories inside to increase the capacity for prison labor. But currently in the prison system, like most people have jobs if they can in the prison system, because it's people who are inside who actually run prisons. It screws the guards. They literally just open the doors and they lock them again. Like, they don't do the cleaning. They don't do the, like, you know, any of the actual maintenance of the prison on the day-to-day. It's people inside who do that. It's prisoners inside who are doing, like, personal care for other prisoners who are sick, who have chronic illnesses and stuff, particularly in the pandemic when they got rid of even more healthcare staff and things. But, like, yeah, so just bearing in mind that, like, prisoners are constantly working in prison, and it's used, like, okay, so if you are, like, you know, if they deem you to be, like, behaving well or whatever, then, like, you can have access to better paid jobs and stuff. But as you said so brilliantly, that, like, it costs money to be in prison. It costs money to buy your toothpaste and anything that you need. Like, it also costs a lot of money to BT, to make your phone calls. It costs, you know, it's not just these companies that are exploiting people through prison labor, but it's all of these companies that also profit off of prisons, right? And so lots of these companies also you'll see in other places, like it's Sodexo who does the catering for most prisons, right?
They're the ones getting that 49,000 per head, by the way. Those companies, that's
they're the ones getting all that money, and then they're also doing the catering for your universities and your schools, and they're doing the facilities management. Is Serco, it's like all of these
housing.
Yeah, you know, it's Kier is building prisons. They're also building student accommodation and hospitals, and
HP is doing the security on the buildings.
Yeah, and Kier is building HS2 as well, right? And so, but it's just thinking about these massive contracts going to these huge corporations, like all like continuing to build up like how much they spend on prisons.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just say as well, just to like finish the point on prison labour, that if you looked like to the US, for example, so it has like huge environmental like implications. So like firefighters, incarcerated firefighters make up like a huge amount of like the force that goes against Californian wildfires. They're paid like despicable amounts of money. Tiny amounts of money, and one person that was in prison died a few years ago, and there's obviously huge health and safety risks, the danger to your lungs, the pollution from the wildfires. It's a huge risk, but these people are coerced into doing it, and they're told that they can get jobs out of it once they leave prison, they can get jobs as firefighters, and the research shows that that has actually not happened at all. That isn't the case, so it's complete coercion, and it's essentially environmental slavery.
The stigma of having been convicted and having been in prison is like so far outweighs any experience that you may have got in prison for any work that like typically it's not translating to people getting better jobs. And I think we really need to be vigilant about like these kinds of schemes that are all about like getting like people in prison like degrees and skills and all this kind of stuff, because we really need to be asking like, why couldn't people access those things before they ended up in prison? That's the question that we need to be asking. That's like, how are we creating the resources for people to access these things before they go to prison? Because like coming out of prison, you're much more likely to be homeless. You haven't been able to pay your rent for however long you were in prison. You're like much more likely to be unemployed and be in a worse position when you come out of prison. And we should be looking at how we can like stop people going to prison in the first place, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm afraid we've run out of time for any more questions.
Can I make a very quick comment? I'm sorry to be late. I'll be very quick. I'm so sorry.
I respect elders. So
sorry, I know we're pressed for time, but I thought I should just mention as well as I'm so glad that the issue of prisons is part of the debate discussions today. It's really been great. But also there's a big fight against detention centers in this country, which are another form of prison.
Yes.
And I know that one of the things, it's worth mentioning some of the strengths in the movement, which is there's a network of people that are organizing against the Rwanda plan and also the detention center in Manston. And they are young, it's a group called AADD, and they've been doing great work. And so I think it's worth people knowing about the actual grassroots work that's happening. There are people in Kent who do beach work, which they meet people off the boats and make sure that they get comfort, food, and safety. There have been a long series of hunger strikes inside detention centers led by women. And it's really important that women are not left out when we're talking about our struggles. There's not time to go into it, but there's going to be a workshop here, and we'll be hearing about Andhra Pradesh. One of our sisters is here. And it's where something like 150,000 women have formed self-help groups to do natural farming, and they've completely transformed the land. And I think that when we fight against prisons, we also have to be looking internationally to the struggles that are giving us strength, led by women, and who are absolutely at the forefront. And we just campaigning for a care income, because a guaranteed care income for everybody who does caring work, all genders, all identities, because we have to take the money into our own hands, from the billionaires, the corporations that you all talked about, all the people who are plundering and robbing us. We've got to take the money back, because unless it's in our hands, how can we make the lives, you know, the caring society that we want to live in? So thank you again for making this space possible, and I'm just delighted to be here. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's a great way to end things, and the next session is going to be really, really amazing lead on from this, so I really invite you to stick around. Thanks, everyone. I think, come up to us if you have any further questions and want to continue the conversation, because it's just starting, and I'm sure we'll have future conversations around this as well. Thanks so much to our speakers. It was amazing.
Thank you.